Thank you for joining us again tonight. This is our last class in the book that the Walderans have on A Remnant Shall Return. We'd started this some time ago and now want to try to finish it up on this last Wednesday night video that we're going to have. Next Wednesday night, if you're able to join us, we'll be meeting in the building in our normal first Wednesday night of the odd month exercise of singing songs in praise to God. And we invite you all to join us if you can be with us. This evening, we're going to try to cover a lot of material in a little time, but hope we can do that in a way that it's understandable. We could do this in several different ways. We could try to talk about the details of all of the history and how it affected the situation in the New Testament times. And if we did that, we'd probably be needing several different weeks. We could look at an overview of it in just a few minutes by introducing what major empires came in. And that would take just a very few minutes. We're going to try to go in the middle of that and notice some details, but not a great deal of detail, mostly centering in on why do you have the system or the situation that you have in the New Testament times? Where did it come from? How do we trace that? When we leave off in the Old Testament, we're dealing with the Jews who have come back from captivity and now under the Medo-Persian Empire are rebuilding their walls, rebuilding their temple, all of those kind of things done. Yet we find them at a place where they have not fully reformed as they should have, to come back to the law and back to the will of God. It's a very different time, though, than what we see in the New Testament. And so we want to kind of notice some differences there and how it got from where we left off in the book of Malachi to where we pick up into the Gospels. When you look at the situation in the Old Testament, you have the Assyrian captivity. If you notice this down here, the times BC, 721 BC, there's the fall that takes place of Samaria, and the northern kingdom of Israel is taken into captivity. The Assyrians are overcome by the Babylonians, and then you have in 606 the starting of the Babylonian captivity as they overcame Judah. They destroyed Jerusalem, and there are three taking aways, the 606 time, then you have the 596, 597, and then you have that which is taking place in about 586 BC, which is the last captivity being taken into Babylon. You have then the return of those from Babylon in 536 under the decree of Cyrus, and that's where you have the Medo-Persians start to reign. But what we recognized, as we talked about it last time, was there was not only in the time of Daniel the Babylonian Empire, where Nebuchadnezzar was said to be that head of gold, but you also have one that will come after him, a world kingdom as well, where the chest and arms are made of silver. That's the Medo-Persian Empire, as we noted, as they come to overthrow the Babylonians. After them came two that we do not find in the text of the Old Testament. But before the time of the gospel of Christ, these two come along. First, the belly and thigh of bronze from that statue represented the Grecian Empire. As you recognize the statements that Daniel makes in prophecy about the various things that were going to take place, you see both of these dealt with prophetically, but not yet to the time that is there. That comes about in about 331 or so, and then the Grecian Empire that follows Alexander and the things that take place from there. The last one brought up in that image is the legs and feet of married clay or mixed with clay, iron and clay. That's the Roman Empire, as it was pointed out in the days of those kings meaning the Roman Empire, there would come about a stone that would come upon that. And that Roman Empire, that's when the kingdom of God would be declared. That clearly is what happens in the time that we have of the New Testament. That Jesus comes and he lives, dies for our sins, was sacrificed, raised to show his divine nature and the fact that he is that Messiah. And then Mark points out in Mark 16 that when he ascends, he sits down at the right hand of God. We're translated, Colossians chapter 1 says, into the kingdom of Christ when we come into him. And so that kingdom began at that point. As you look at it, after the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that's when that kingdom took place. And in fact, that was during the time of the Roman Empire in the physical world. Now, when we look at that timeline of the years of silence, what we notice then are points that are made regarding the Persian rule, and then of Alexander the Great and his starting of that Greek or Hellenistic empire. And then you have those that come after them of the Roman Empire, and we're going to notice the effect on the Jews in their area, that there was a time of relative independence, and we're going to notice that as we go through. Last week, we looked a little bit at that 400 years of silence and what was involved, and considering the threads that are to be brought in. The Persian history, obviously, that's where we leave off as we're in the book of Malachi, is during that Medo-Persian history. And then you have the Grecian history that will come after that. First started by Philip of Macedon and extended by Alexander the Great, who brought it to the full extent of its power. He was succeeded then by four that we'll get into a little bit more, especially those first two of the Ptolemaic Empire under Ptolemy, and then also of Seleucus, or the Seleucid Empire that was there. Then you have Antipater and Antigonus that we'll talk about as well. The Roman history then comes after that, and how that affects then the Jewish history, the primary thread that we're trying to look at, how these three impact it is what we want to look at. The fact of the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint as it's put, and the development of the sects among the Jews are going to have to be looked at before we come to an understanding of where we are by the time we open our New Testaments. And then the Maccabean revolt that was before that, and the Herodian family where they come in along the line. As you look at that Jewish history then, you notice that those Greeks, the Ptolemies, the Syrians, or Seleucids are all going to be talked about, and we want to try to bring together how that took place. That then affected when you have the Seleucid Empire coming in, which is one of the branches of the Grecian Empire. It's one of those successors after Alexander the Great. When they come in, they're going to reign with such fury that then the Jews have a backlash from that, what's called the Maccabean Revolt, and we want to look there. Now, let's look at these events in a kind of an overview way that took place during this intertestamental period. First, with Alexander the Great. We noticed last time that, as we discussed, when you have the time of Malachi's writing, about 420 BC, you did not yet have Alexander on the scene. He's the son of Philip of Macedon, who started to unite many of the Greek city-states that were there in order to fight against the Persians. The Persians had come in and in many cases destroyed some of the things of the Greek civilization that had been known for a long time. For instance, they came in and burned and destroyed the Acropolis in Athens. The Greeks never forgave them for this, and they are ones that decided they would get together and be able to overcome those people of the Persian Empire. They did that because they were ones who were very well trained in warfare. The Greeks had that as a part of their study and of their history, as how the tactical impact that you had from armies could be able to bring about a good success. Indeed, they were the only real trained army of that time. And as a result of that, they were able to overcome with less people those kingdoms that had more people because of their tactical advantage. When you look at the spread of Hellenistic culture, the Greek language, and the philosophy, that's one of the things that Alexander wanted to bring about. He saw other kingdoms that had influenced the world greatly, but he very firmly believed that influence of the Greek world was the best influence on man to that date. He had been educated by Aristotle. Aristotle had taken much of his philosophy from Socrates, and then one of the students of Socrates, Plato. And Aristotle comes along and systematizes that. Philip hires him to be a tutor there to Alexander, and so he learned a great deal by all testimony. Alexander was an extremely intelligent man and very driven as well, with a great deal of energy. Founding of Alexandria in Egypt was where the Septuagint was done, and that Alexandria was named after none other than Alexander the Great. He founded that because he wanted it to be a city of culture. Yes, it was in the very northern part of Egypt, but it was made to be one of the places where Alexander went and conquered other empires or other countries, and then put a center of Greek culture. Alexandria especially came to have a very dominant influence because of its literature and other things that were there. At Alexander's death, Antigonus was the one who claimed to have the empire, that he would be the one who would take over at that time. But he was slain by Lysimachus and Seleucus, and those two then took over the area that he had. When you look at that area, it was that Antipater had taken Greece and Macedonia. Then you had Antigonus, who had taken Asia Minor. Lysimachus then came in and took over basically their areas, what we would call the western part of that Grecian Empire. Then you had Ptolemy, who came along, and he had Egypt at first, and then also had overcome Palestine in the very beginning of that aftermath of Alexander. The Seleucids come along. They had Syria and the eastward parts, what we would call some of the old Persian areas. And they ruled that, but in about 198 BC, they took over the area of Palestine. You see, it was important for them to have Palestine, each one thought, because it was a buffer between the main areas of their empires. The Ptolemies wanted to retain Egypt. So to retain Egypt, they would want the buffer zone to the north of that in Palestine. But the Seleucids wanted to maintain the Persian areas that they had. But to do that, the easiest way is to have Palestine. And there you have a choke point for how they could take care of this. One of the main tactics of warfare that the Greeks had learned was how to limit a battlefield, how to bring it into a place where there were more people coming against them if they made a narrowed battlefield, and then they would only need to face a few of those soldiers. However many of them they had behind them, they could only have a front line that was so far across. And the Greeks did a wonderful job of that. As a result of that, they many times were able to overcome enemies, just like they were of the Persians, of having 4 or 5 times the amount of soldiers that they had. But they figured it out in such a way that it was brought to be an advantage which they moved at by tactical means, and also some of the accoutrements of warfare that they had. When you look at the Ptolemaic rule in Palestine specifically, the priests were running the Jewish internal affairs. In other words, they were ones who did those things that had to do with day-to-day action. When the Seleucids came in, they defeated Antiochus, Antiochus III was a Seleucid king, and he overcomes the Ptolemies there. Now, Antiochus III was also called Epiphanes. He took then religious control over at that point. Judaism then was outlawed, and they replaced the God of Israel, Jehovah. They brought in the Greek polytheism to take over that place. The copies of the law that they could find were burned, and then they said that the Jews could not travel to Jerusalem for their feasts. When you look at circumcision, they said that and the keeping of the Sabbath were also declared illegal. Their high priest was disposed, and from that time on, there is no legitimate high priest. Now you think about the point of this. God had mandated from the Old Testament exactly how that high priest was to be qualified, that he was to come from the family of Aaron, not only the tribe of Levi, but from that family of Aaron, and that had been followed up to this point. Yet, when you come down to this time, that high priest is taken away, he now becomes a political pawn. And from that point on, that's how it was. This helps us to understand a few things. Jesus shows no great deference to the high priests of his day, Annas and Caiaphas. Why? Well, for one reason, because they weren't legitimate high priests. Paul, who was known to be one on the Sanhedrin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as he called himself, he was one who looked at the high priest and he said, I did not know you were God's anointed. When you look at that, say, well, does that mean he'd never seen him before? Well, sure it had. He had grown up knowing who was the high priest. But what does he point out? He points out the fact that that one who is high priest is not lawfully high priest by the cause of God. If you look to the Old Testament, he did not have the qualifications. Now, not only that, but from this time on, basically, you have those who have a more political angle who are going to be high priests. It's not so much the responsibilities that are religious that they're looking at. It's more the high priests and the chief priests are those who are going to rule in a political fashion and try to bring about that which is favorable for the Jews in a political sense. And so that's the way they're going to think. Instead of having Jehovah be worshipped, they brought in a new brazen altar that was there. And what they offered is they offered that which was worshipped to Zeus on that altar. Instead of the altar of God, there now is the altar of the idol god Zeus. And they offered pigs on that altar. And so now what do you have? You have something that is a shame by the Jewish way. The law had made very clear that they were not, pigs were not, those animals that were clean. There could not be that which was offered on the altar. But they do that and offer it to a false god. Swine and other unclean animals then were all offered there, and there had to be a cleansing that would take place at that point. And that's where we come to the Maccabean revolt. The priest by the name of Matthias comes along at that point, and he's going to rebel. He fled to the hills to form a rebellion together with his sons. Those sons were Judas the Maccabee, Jonathan, and Simon. They're going to join him in this effort to overcome the Seleucid rulers at this point. At Mattathias' death then, Judas took over and he defeated Lysias in 165 BC. Judas returned to Jerusalem, purified the temple. That's where the Jews get their term Hanukkah, or Feast of Lights. It's referred to one time in the New Testament as well. What had taken place was that when those animals that were unclean, the swine and so forth, were offered on the altar, they had to take that altar away. They had to do that which was bringing in a new one, the bringing forth of the altar of God as it had been declared under the Old Testament law. That's how it was built. And they replaced that there after they've given that time for purification and the lights that were pointed out. There is some other suggestion with regard to how these lights went on and were able to stay on. That's a part of that story that we won't get into. But mainly the idea of purification was there. When Lysias returned in 160 BC, Judas then was killed in battle. So now they're coming back and trying to restore that power. Jonathan then took over it, and the political acceptance of the regional powers was done at that point, and there was kind of an easy, if you will, peace, tension that was somewhat there, but they had some level of peace. This rule was maintained until he was murdered in 142 BC. At that point, Simon, one of the other sons of Mattathias, took over and was given independence by Syria. That had been earned. This began what was called the Hasmonean dynasty of the high priesthood, which lasted until it was overturned by Herod and the Romans. So now we've got a little bit different way, and it's going to be something that's handed down father to son, all right, but not from the right lineage as given in the Old Testament law. Now we've got another one, and it's going to be brought under control by all of those who are political until you have another change in political power. Now you have a relative independence of Judah. And as they have that, or as it's now called Judea, and as they have that relative independence, Simon then is murdered in about 134 by his son-in-law. These were real nice families, loving as they could be during that time, you understand. But now Simon is murdered, and what happens? Now we've got John Hyrcanus taking control for 30 years, and this is probably the greatest stability during that period at that time. After John Hyrcanus' death, the political situation was totally unstable. Now notice what you have there. That's around the year 100 that you would have BC. And so now it's very unstable at that point. In the midst of the confusion, there's a fellow who comes along who's an Idumean. This was those who were part of the Edomite nation, joined with others at that time. They did not stay pure in that way, just like the Samaritans didn't, but mostly those of an Edomite background. His name was Antipater II, and he took control in about 47 BC together with the help of the Roman promise behind him. When he did that, in 43 BC, Antipater was assassinated, and Herod the Great took power. Now that's the one we know of from the New Testament. The start of the Herod family begins really with Antipater II, but Herod the Great is where it reached its culmination. Herod the Great was one who was a great believer in trying to do great favors for the Jews, mainly so that they wouldn't bother him. They had had a history of rebellion and problems over and over again, and so what happens is Herod the Great decides at first, I'll be one who gives them a bunch of things that they like, and as a result of that, then they'll fall in under me. Well, it didn't quite work that way. He built the greatest temple that they had seen since the time of Solomon. You remember during the time of Haggai, it was seen as nothing in comparison, the temple that they built then to the temple which was built in the time of Solomon. Now, Herod the Great comes in and brings in much wonderful building. It was beautiful. It was called one of the wonders of the world of its time. And as he did that, he also was involved in bringing other things that they weren't so happy with. He was an arrogant man, like most who decide they want to be some sort of a dictator. And as a result of that, the Jews grew in their resentment of him. At first it was good, and then it became not so good. But he had the Roman Empire behind him and their power, so he stayed in power during that time. As you see the Herodian family go from him, they get more and more as those who are less caring about the things of what the Jews wanted, and more bowing to the wishes of the Romans. Interesting in one way, Herod the Great was a man who had wanted and tried to cultivate that love of the Jewish people. And yet by the time he was an old man and about to die, he ordered that 70 elderly men of the Israelites, and respected men, 70 of them be captivated. The reason was he wanted them killed when he died, because he knew that was the only way the Jewish people would cry when he died. Now that is someone who went to an extreme for some mourners in his funeral. But at any rate, they're ones who get worse and worse as you see them come along. Let's look a little bit at the empire of Rome and how it began in its place with its interplay with Judaism, or with the Jews. Palestine was conquered by Pompey. He was a general of Julius Caesar in about 64 BC. Julius became the ruler then as one who was Caesar. He had been part of a triumvirate before, but now he becomes to be the Caesar, and he's murdered in about 44 BC. We know the story behind that. The rule was split between a man by the name of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, until Octavian came to have the power. He was then called Augustus Caesar. In other words, the highest Caesar, the maximum Caesar. And so when you look at that, he's the first one we find in the New Testament. Jesus is born, according to the book of Luke, during the time when Augustus was Caesar of that Roman Empire. Augustus, or Octavian as he was known there, ruled from 27 BC to AD 14. So let's just think about that for a minute. That's before the birth of Christ, when Jesus was born, and then into the teen years of Jesus, really, as you have that. Augustus is not the one in power when Jesus would have started his personal ministry. But that time through about AD 14 in the New Testament, that's when he would have ruled. Tiberius was the next one, and he would have ruled from AD 14 to 37. Now think about that rule for a minute. That's the time that you're going to find not only the personal ministry of Jesus in Judea and Galilee, but you're also going to see that as the time of the crucifixion, probably about AD 29, and then the beginning of the church, of when you get those years of fast growth and some of these things taking place. Now, during Tiberius's reign, there's not a persecution of Christians because they're not even really understood or known in Rome. They're the ones who are existing mainly over in Palestine still before that spread became vast as it did in later years. But he's going to be ruling during that first part of Christianity. The Western world during that time was under what's called the Pax Romana, the peace of 1,000 years, the peace of Rome. And the point was, they had everything under their place. Now was when you had what God saw as the fullness of times. You remember Paul refers to that Jesus was born of a virgin, born under the law in the fullness of times. Why is it the fullness of times? Well, we're going to look at this more, but the language all through that world of the West, all the way over to India, had come under the influence of Alexander the Great and others that were there. As a result of that, all the way over to there, Greek was well known. Not just any Greek. The classical Greek was not what it was. It was an unrefined form, what was known as a Greek that was of the people of the common day. And that common day Greek, Koine Greek it was called, was something that everyone would have known in those empires at that time. Why? Because you had that paved by Alexander the Great. It's where travel was able to be done through a vast part of the world by the peace of Rome. The pirates that would have been there 200 years before would have made traveling on the Mediterranean almost impossible. The piracy that you would have had within Judea itself in the century before Christ would have made perilous travel in such a way that you couldn't have had many people go to carry the gospel much at all. The Romans built roads. The other ways in which travel was facilitated is something that is rarely looked at, but we need to see as a part of what was there in that fullness of time, allowing the gospel to spread. You look at the advantages of spreading the gospel, and I dare say you could not find until maybe more of the current culture, you couldn't have found a time where you're able to spread the gospel further with an easier sense of travel and with an ease of language that is given in an almost worldwide sense. And other things that were like that. That is when Jesus and his disciples came into this world and spread the gospel of Christ. Now, let's look kind of quickly at the effects of the intertestamental period. When you look, major advantage, as we say, changes came with the Hellenistic world. Started with Alexander the Great, really, as he took over and had that kind of influence pushed. Nothing was inherently wrong with Greek language. As a matter of fact, it is a great benefit when we think about it. Not only was it an exacting language in the way Hebrew was not, but it also was one in which just shortly after the New Testament period, the language becomes a dead language. Koine Greek is not at all like modern Greek. It ceases at that time. What does that do? Well, that means you cease the change of words. Even in our language, words can change in a way that's 180 degrees the opposite over time. You don't have that change with Koine Greek. You have the Greek philosophy, however, that came with the Greek language. And the Greek culture that was there then caused what? Well, when you had that scripture given into the Greek language, there are many benefits to that. Jesus and the disciples, about 90% of what they quote from the Old Testament is not from the Hebrew Old Testament. It's from the Septuagint version, the Greek version of the Old Testament. But when it was there among those of the Greeks, then they started to apply their Greek philosophy and their way of looking at it in allegorical terms. Philo of Alexandria, a Greek, had great influence continuing on into New Testament times as he did that very thing. And basically, as we've talked about in our church history class, the time just after the gospel had also to deal with this as it was applied into Christianity of this allegorical sense. Well, when Scripture is not seen as literally true, then what happens? It loses its relevance. And by what happens is it just becomes that which is a story. Israel, the area around Judea, and Galilee and so forth, had been preoccupied with political upheaval. And the fact is that the law became less and less the focus of what they were to do and what kind of society they were going to have, as they had more and more of those political things. The political dominance came to focus everything, and mostly with regard to not only daily life, but culture, the way they looked at the world, the emphasis they had with regard to their priorities and so forth. Now, most people cease to have much of an understanding of the law. In fact, some of them knew as little of the Old Testament law as what we saw back in the Old Testament when it was lost. Why? Because there was something that happened. The law was left to be interpreted by others and then dispensed to the people as a whole. And when that started happening, what happened was there was a trust of the Maccabean leaders and others by the success that they were having. This must be okay with God. And now what happened? As they got away from the law, and yet they had political kind of a independence, they thought somehow God was blessing that. The tendency was to trust the changes that they made then were those that were authorized of God. And therefore, what did they do? They looked at it by the influences that were working on them. The philosophy from the Greeks, the devaluing of the law, and the beginning of more and more traditions of man made them shift their focus away from the law. Let me try to illustrate that. God gave the Old Testament law for guidance. That law was what they were to meditate in both day and night, the psalmist talks about. The number of passages we could talk about of looking to the law for their guidance would be inexhaustible. But here's what happened. Jewish tradition decided that if the law is so important, we need to build a hedge around the law. And the hedge around the law was what they had of their rabbinical traditions, or the rabbi's interpretation of that Old Testament law. The original intent of it was, we don't want to violate the law, so we're going to back off and demand a little bit more. And that way we'll be sure not to violate the law. Well, how do you think that's going to work? In time, when the law ceases to be seen, and you're looking at the hedge around the law, what became Talmudic law kind of things, the Mishnah was partially in print at this point of time, or it was starting to be written down, completed sometime in that way, the Mishnah about 200, 250 AD. But now they're starting to write down these interpretations. And what happens? What happens is with the Mishnah and the Talmudic rabbinical traditions, they became the law. So the law was what men said that it was. Now what's the result of that going to be? Instead of focusing on God's law, you're going to have to focus on what human traditions say. So one thing I want to warn against in the early part of this Years of Silence book that the Waldrons have, the statement is made that in New Testament times, they were very careful to keep the law. For instance, that of tithing. They even tithed Annas and Cumin. And they were very careful to keep the tithe offerings as a whole. They also pointed out that there was a great keeping of the Sabbath, that the Jews even decided to hang or to crucify Jesus because of him healing on the Sabbath day. I want you to rethink that. That does not come because they're trying to keep the law very carefully. What Jesus deals with in Matthew chapter 15 and in Mark chapter 9, or Mark chapter 7, pardon me, the two of those parallels, look at that and see what the problem was. The problem was not that they were trying to keep the law very clearly. They were trying to keep the traditions of the elders, what was later known as the Mishnah. They had replaced the Old Testament law with what the rabbis said about it. And as a result of that, they were not focusing on the law. They were involved in making additions and subtraction to the Old Testament law that then they justified. Now, when you see that, you recognize this was not a matter of people trying to adhere to the Old Testament law. This was a change, and that change went after the way that ultimately corrupted Judaism in every fashion through a Talmudic rule. And that was the rabbis, those who interpreted the law, told you what it meant, and nobody ever looked at the law anymore. Well, I appreciate you looking at this with us. I thank you for studying some of these things. As we said, 2 weeks from tonight, we'll begin our class in the auditorium according to the present plan at the 84th Street Congregations building. We're going to be talking about the book of Ecclesiastes then. I'll be teaching on Sunday morning to the high school class that book of Ecclesiastes, and we'll be going at it on Wednesday evening in the adult class in the auditorium. If you can be with us, please join us. Thank you so much for joining us for these studies. May God bless you. Good night.